Dear students of course A403 on work values and ethics, welcome. This is the second part of the chapter number 7 on the integrity approaches. Now, in the previous part of this chapter, we tried to distinguish between the compliance and the integrity approach, and we have discussed in detail a table that was presented in this book comparing both approaches according to various criteria. In this part, we shall continue with the distinction between the compliance and the integrity approach. The compliance approach is counterproductive. As I said in the previous part, the compliance approach focuses more on prevention, prohibition, avoidance. So avoiding sanctions, avoiding punishment, prohibiting unethical conduct, of course, and so on. So it is counterproductive. It seeks to prevent something, but it does not seek to build the moral values of the individuals, or it does not seek to improve, foster, promote the integrity of the individual. It tries to avoid or cut or prevent unethical behavior, but it is not trying to build anything in the individuals. Whereas the integrity approach is more successful and leads to more positive results. Remember, I've always said that, for example, when raising children, you can deliver the same message in two ways. Either you follow a positive tone focusing on how to behave, or you would follow a negative tone that focuses on preventing negative behavior. So, for example, when we follow a positive tone, we would say, please be punctual, please do your homework, please eat your food. But if you follow a negative tone, you would say, if you do not eat your food, then you will not receive, for example, dessert, or you would not receive a reward, or something like this. Okay, so here you are using the same message, but in one of two ways, either a positive tone or a negative tone. Positive tones always are more successful and help characters and personalities rather than the negative counterproductive tones. Okay? However, the choice of following one of both approaches depends on the ethical awareness of your employees. If you find them ethically aware, then you don't need to follow the compliance approach with them. The integrity approach would achieve more success with them. Also, it depends upon the attitudes and behavior of the employees. If they are by nature adopting ethical behavior and ethical reasoning, so there is no need to focus on compliance, prohibition, prevention, etc. Just adopt the integrity approach. Also, if you had a strong ethical organizational culture with a strong ethical leadership, then you can easily rely on integrity rather than on compliance. Also, if there is fair treatment of the employees and people inside the organization feel that this organization is fair, is just, and so on, then most probably they would behave ethically, and in that case, integrity would be enough. Whereas if they felt that there is injustice, no fairness inside the organization, then in that case, they might resort to what we have discussed before in our lectures, what we call politics, right? So they would resort to these ways in order to achieve some rights, some entitlements, and so on. So in that case, they might actually resort to unethical behavior or unethical conduct. And in that case, you would need to apply the compliance approach. Also, The choice of using either the integrity approach or the compliance approach would depend on the integration of ethics in discussions and decision making. In case you were referring all the time to the ethical values inside your organization, and you are referring to these values in your discussions, in your work, in your social relationships inside the organization, and so on, so, and as well as in decision making, so you can rely on the integrity approach alone. But if you do not integrate or embed these ethical values in your discussions, relationships, and decision making processes, then in that case, you are going to adopt most probably a compliance approach that seeks to prevent the people from having unethical behavior or committing unethical acts and conduct and so on. So again, the choice depends upon what we have called before the ethical infrastructure that exists in the organization. Also, in the compliance approach, as we said before, we rely so often on the external controls that are imposed on the individuals. And again, I come back to say that external controls can be imposed by the organization itself or outside the organizations, such as those laws that are actually imposed by the legislative bodies in a country. Okay, so but in all cases, they are external to the individual and they are imposed on him. And they also follow a top down approach or are considered top down instruments. And so on. Whereas in the in the integrity approach, we tend to follow internal controls that aim to internalize moral values in order to foster ethical conduct. So we rely so often on training, exchange of information and experience, of course, rewarding exemplary behavior, stressing on the importance of having an ethical leadership as well as ethical organizational culture. However, even though somebody of you might tell me, but Dr. Iman, training, exchange of information, rewarding, ethical leadership, and ethical culture are all controls that are external to the individual. Correct. But these aim at internalizing moral values. So we use training in order to educate the employees on the moral values and principles that they should follow inside the organization. Or when we use exchange of information, we help each other think in an ethical way, behave in an ethical way, and so on. So we motivate each other to behave ethically. Also, when we use rewarding, this encourages the individual to behave in an ethical way. Also, when an individual finds that his leader is behaving in an ethical way, then he would be also encouraged to behave ethically. The same thing with the ethical culture. If the ethical culture inside the organization is stressing so much on the ethical values and so on, so people would be motivated to behave accordingly rather than wait for something to be imposed on them. Again, both the integrity approach and the compliance approaches, they are distinct from each other, and sometimes they are considered at both ends of the same spectrum. However, we shouldn't consider them as mutually exclusive. As a matter of fact, many companies or organizations might even use a mix of both. And we cannot say which kind of a mix should we follow? As a matter of fact, many public organizations do not have a consistent approach at all, meaning that we cannot tell you in these and these circumstances or with these kinds of employees, you'd better use the compliance approach or the integrity approach. There is no best mix that can be applied for all organizations or for all situations. Sometimes even organizations, whether public or private, they might follow one of both approaches in certain circumstances, while as follow the other approach in other circumstances. It all depends upon the context, the contingencies that the organization is facing. It depends upon the strength of your ethical infrastructure. It depends upon the kind of employees that you have and their motivation. All these would determine the right mix of both approaches and when to use either one of both approaches or the mix of both approaches. We cannot say that we would adopt either of these approaches all the time or the mix of these all the time. It all depends on the context, the contingencies, and so on. Education and training in order to have ethical decision making? Well, first we need to know that regardless of the approach that is going to be adopted in the organization, ethics will always remain an individual responsibility, meaning that no individual can simply complain that he or she committed an unethical act because no instruments existed in the organization, whether we are talking about internal instruments or external instruments or controls. So no individual could simply say, I had to behave in an unethical way because nobody told me how to behave. Ethics will always remain an individual responsibility. The public officials or the employees in general would be responsible to meet the laws, even if they receive no education and training on them. So they still have to meet the laws as well as respond to organizational demands and meet the societal values. And this actually brings us to what we have discussed before in previous lectures about the fact that when an individual behaves ethically, then harmony between individual values, organizational values, and societal values would ensue in many cases. I'm not going to generalize, but I would say that in most of the cases, if we behave ethically, then there would be harmony between the individual values, the societal values, as well as the organizational values. So, in that case, it's again the responsibility of each and every employee to meet and respect as well as comply with the laws, the organizational demands, and the societal values. Also, they have to behave ethically in order to achieve the organizational goals and societal interests. So, it's not just about complying with laws, but it's also about behaving in an ethical ways to achieve the organizational goals and the societal goals. So it's not just important to behave ethically and disregard organizational goals. So to say we cannot achieve our targets because ethics is expensive or ethics does not make us efficient enough. No, you need to consider all those aspects. You need to behave in an ethical way that would also lead to the achievement of organizational goals and societal interests. So never complain by saying ethics would not necessarily lead to efficiency. No, this is not true. Also, regardless of the approach that is going to be adopted in the organization, the employees would have to act based on their sense of duty. So in that case, here we're coming back to our talk about objective responsibility and subjective responsibility. So, in case the employees are acting or performing their duties because they pay great attention to the expectations of other stakeholders. So, in that case, we are talking about objective responsibility and adopting most probably the compliance approach. Whereas, if they were acting based upon their own sense of duty, regardless of the expectations of others, but because they are convinced that when they do their duties, they actually foster the welfare of their organization and their society, then here we are talking about subjective responsibility, and most probably we're talking about the integrity approach. When talking about ethical decision making, well, it is important to know that when employees make ethical decisions, they go through four basic phases or processes. Number one is moral sensitivity, where they would recognize that the situation that they are witnessing or facing is ethical in its nature. It's not political, it's not economic, it's not legal, but it's ethical. Okay? And once they realize the nature of the situation that they are facing, they would go to the second phase, which is moral judgment, in which they would decide to behave in an ethical way, and they would decide which action is considered to be morally right in this situation. Then, after they have decided what action is considered to be morally right, they would go to the third phase, which is moral motivation or intent. It's not enough to decide that this action is the proper ethical action for this situation, but you have to also be motivated to really implement this proper ethical action. Remember when we talked about Kohlberg's model and about the criticisms directed to Kohlberg's model? And one of these criticisms said that Kohlberg's model of moral judgment tells us how we think in an ethical way, right? But it does not really mean that we are going to behave in this ethical way. And we said that sometimes our emotions, our feelings might actually make us behave in a certain way that is completely different from our ethical judgment. Okay? Maybe we hate something or we love something, so this makes us behave in a different way than our moral judgment. Okay, so this is why when we make ethical decisions, we have to go to the phase number three, which is moral motivation, to make sure that we are committed to implement this ethical decision, this ethical act that we consider to be the proper ethical behavior in this situation. And once we have committed ourselves to behave in this ethical way, we shall go through the fourth and last phase, which is moral character, where we would demonstrate persistence in following moral principles. So here we would say we are not going just to behave ethically in this only particular situation, but we demonstrate persistence to behave ethically in all the situations that we are going to face in the organization. So we would insist on behaving ethically in the organization in all the cases or circumstances. And now, since we were talking about ethical decision making, and the four phases of it. It is important to realize that education and training increase moral awareness. So, in case you want to increase moral decision making, it is important that the organization would provide ethical training and education, because this would increase the moral awareness of the employees, leading thereby to better ethical decisions and ethical decision making. Also, it is important to realize that the individual's level of cognitive moral development influences their moral judgment. So, here we are referring to the different stages of Kohlberg's model and where the individual exists relatively to those stages based upon his cognitive moral development. Again, Kohlberg in his model intended to show us how we decide what is right, what is wrong, based upon which reasons. So he actually tried to demonstrate to us how we use moral reasoning, whether based upon uh, our self interests and what is good for us. So, based upon avoiding punishment, as it is the case in the pre conventional phase or level, sorry, or based upon conformity to the expectations of others, as it is the case in the conventional level, or based upon certain principles of justice and human rights that would guide a few individuals and make them take decisions based upon their own self chosen principles, as it is the case with the post conventional level, or what we call the principled level as well. Again, most of the people are, according to Kohlberg's model, at the conventional level. So they follow the rules and regulations and try to meet the expectations of the others. Also, it is important to note that with regard to the officials, the organizations must play an important role to increase moral awareness. This can take place, of course, through training, education, strengthening an ethical organizational culture in the organization, and so on. Also, leadership can play an important role, especially as it would set the ethical tone inside the organization and play a role model for all employees. Also, most of the training programs should be on ethical decision making models, so basically on how to analyze ethical situations and how to make decisions in these ethical dilemmas, and also on the right ethical framework, which are basically the different procedures that can be followed in order to be able to make the correct ethical decisions. Now, literature emphasizes certain factors that should exist in the training programs provided to the employees in order to make them successful. For example, number one, it is important to teach and educate your employees on how to identify and apply one's own values at work, for example, because this would impact moral judgment. Because sometimes people might advocate or espouse certain values, but they do not know how to implement or apply these values on their work activities. And in that case, this of course would have an impact on how they would make ethical decisions. But if they know how to apply the values, then definitely this would facilitate ethical decision making. For example, when an employee knows that transparency means to, for example, offer not so sensitive information to everyone, then in case somebody asked for access to sensitive information, he would easily know that he is not, for example, supposed to do so. And in that case, he would not be in a confusing situation where he cannot decide whether this is acceptable or not, ethically acceptable or not. Another factor is also to investigate the relationship of certain factors such as age, education, position, and level of autonomy on the ability of moral judgment and making moral decisions or ethical decisions. Remember uh, I don't remember, I think it was in the chapter on public service motivation. We were talking about these factors, age, education, and so on, and how they make people be more public service motivated. Okay? However, in the end, we also sometimes said that research has no concluding results regarding these factors. Well, here we tend to say that you should pay attention to these factors when you offer training to the employees. If you find, for example, you need to test whether the old employees are more likely to make moral judgments and take ethical decisions and so on. In that case, maybe you need to help them, and you need maybe to offer also more training programs to the younger employees to allow them or to help them in making ethical decisions. Also, what about education? Remember, we said also that sometimes the well educated people are not so self interested. I urge you to go to chapter 3 on public service motivation and public service ethos. I think we were talking about these factors in more detail. So in that case, you have also to respond to the effect of this factor. If you find out that the less educated have difficulties in making ethical decisions, then you need to provide more education or training programs to them. Position in the organization. If you feel that tenure employees are more likely to be ethically committed than the part-time employees who are not so much affiliated to the organization and so on, maybe you need to offer training to them. Also, what about the level of autonomy and discretion? Sometimes remember the formula of corruption. Corruption equals monopoly plus discretion minus autonomy. Minus accountability. So it again, basically, you need to study whether high levels of autonomy could lead to more unethical conduct or not. And in that case, would you, as an organization, need to provide more training to those employees with high levels of autonomy and discretion or not? Okay. Also, literature has indicated that it is very important that when you educate and teach your employees on ethics, that you bring training situations that are very similar to the work situation so that they can easily understand these situations and also apply the training program on them. And later on, when they go to their work, they can easily apply what they have learned in the training programs on their daily work activities. And this would have, of course, a better effect on the employees. Also, it is very important to use various stimuli to encourage the people to participate in the training programs, whether by encouraging them to participate in exchange for maybe rewards or promotion or something like this, or even appreciation, or to make also the training programs themselves as interesting as possible. And also, it is finally very important to use interactive learning to make the training programs interesting and live, not theoretical, for those employees. Finally, you have to present the rules of the training conditions. For example, that each one has to be committed to the training programs. It's not just a matter of attendance, but they have to participate, they have to be active learners, and so on. Also, to the conditions of the learning environment. For example, that the safety of the employees would be guaranteed. For example, sometimes in the training programs, employees or the trainees exchange opinions, exchange experiences, and so on. And sometimes they might reveal information that are sensitive to the organization or that are like a matter of secrets inside the organization. So in that case, they should also be granted their safety or immunity from any possible retaliation in case they were discussing some of these sensitive issues in order to know how to behave in those situations or how to make ethical decisions. Okay, I mean, here the intention was not to reveal secrets, but to learn how to behave in such maybe sensitive matters. So in that case, you should secure the safety of your employees from any possible retaliation, and also facilitate their learning as much as possible by offering all the needed equipments, resources, and so on. Okay? Nevertheless, it is important to know that even when providing training and education, it is important to realize that in most of the ethical dilemmas, we tend to react and address these situations in a spontaneous way and judge based on our emotions and feelings. So, and this was one of the critiques towards Kohlberg's model, when we said that he tried to present a model that explains how we think in an ethical way or how we judge morally. However, it doesn't put great emphasis on the effect of emotions and feelings on our behavior, because sometimes we might think in one way but behave in another way because of our emotions and feelings. Emotions of, for example, hatred, love, fear, anxiety, and so on. All these emotions and feelings, they can, of course, influence behavior and make it different from the moral judgment of the individual. So, training programs have to address this matter and also explain it to the employees. We are going to discuss the different steps and not phases that we would go through in order to make an ethical decision. This model of ethical decision making is different from the 4 phases that we have discussed in an earlier slide in this lecture, that mentioned actually the 4 phases through which we would go in order to make ethical decisions in the organization and also implement them. But here we are just focusing on the different steps until we decide to or choose an ethical decision. Okay? So, number 1 step is having a perception of an ethical problem. And this is very much similar to the first phase of the 4 phases that we go through, which is moral sensitivity. Here, the officials would face ethical dilemmas, which are situations in which ethics play a role and in which also different values play a role equally, but they might also be conflicting or contradictory. And in that case, the employee would have to identify and map or describe this ethical dilemma or situation that he or she is facing. Then afterwards, we go through the second step, which is describing the ethical problem and defining the ethical situation. So here we would start to gather information about the situation itself. For example, we would start to gather information about the stakeholders who are involved in this situation, or their different points of view, or the ethical risks and challenges attached to this ethical dilemma, or the different values that conflict and compete against each other, which of course might cause this ethical dilemma. So here you would try to define your ethical situation in a very clear way so as to know how best to solve it. After identifying or describing the ethical problem or situation, we start going through step number 3, which is identifying alternatives. And here the employee would start to identify different alternatives or different courses of action for solving this problem. And he or she would not just be satisfied by generating different alternatives, but he or she has also to study the possible consequences and implications of each of these alternatives and whether they do agree with the ethical principles or not. And it is also important in this phase to not to consider these different alternatives in terms of black and white terms. So it is important not to consider them in black or white terms, but rather as different alternatives. Because when considering them in black or white terms, you might consider them as either or as mutually exclusive. You have to only apply one. Now, in that case, you need actually to think of all these alternatives as possible solutions for the ethical dilemma. So you have to generate as many alternatives as possible and discuss or study each alternative with its consequences and implications as much as possible. Never consider any alternative as trivial or as unimportant. You need to consider each possible alternative and study its consequences and so on. After identifying the different alternatives, now it's time to project their possible consequences. So here we don't just mention the possible consequences, but we also identify these consequences based upon whether they are positive or negative. And we try to imagine the different possible scenarios that might take place if we apply these alternatives and how they would influence, for example, the organization or influence the work activities. Okay? After projecting the possible consequences, now it's time to select the best alternative that would solve this ethical dilemma. So here we would choose the best solution that is in line with the personal values and the organizational values as well, and that would also be consistent with the moral compass inside the organization and would be accepted by the wider environment or society. So in that case, you would choose this best alternative that is suitable, morally suitable to personal, organizational, and societal values. By this, we have finished the chapter on the integrity approaches, and I hope that by now you can distinguish between the compliance approaches and the integrity approaches, know the different types of control that each approach advocates, also know how they regard the nature of the employees. By now, you are supposed to know the different tools that might be used in both approaches and how they can be used. I hope you are all doing well and you are taking good care of yourselves, and I hope to see you soon, because actually this type of online lecture is not as interesting as those lectures in which we meet each other and I listen to your questions, your concerns, and we exchange opinions and so on. I miss you all, and I hope you all the happiness, all the success, and take good care of yourselves. Bye.